In the first video on the 17th century, we have taken a look at lyrical poetry, shorter poetry, everything from love poetry to religious poetry. And in this one, we want to focus on epic poetry, so long narrative poetry, by looking at one specific example, one text that really towers above 17th century literature, and that is John Milton's epic Paradise Lost. The conception and the creation of Paradise Lost is very strongly related to its historical and also its literary historical context. In the end of the last video, I showed how the lives of poets were often enmeshed in these religious struggles, differences, political struggles, and that is also true, very much true for Milton. I showed you John Donne as an example of a poet who was born a Catholic, which basically was a suppressed minority at the time in England, and at one point converted to Anglicanism, and then I also at least sort of hinted at Andrew Marvell as a Puritan writer. Now, Milton himself was also a Puritan, and his background, of course, heavily influenced his poem. So it's connected to literary notions. By the attempt to create a new form of epic poetry in this time. Basically every literary age has sort of tried to reinvent the epic ever since its beginnings. In religious terms, it is part of the Puritan project of re-erecting God's realm in this world, thinking about these religious matters. And in political terms, through the time of its creation, we can see how it leads from these original Puritan hopes and struggles to a more despairing outlook, and that has a lot to do with the time frame in which it was created. Now, the gestation and the creation periods run across some of the most turbulent times in English history, and its author was strongly implemented in them, as we could already see from the dates of his life. Milton, as a Puritan in the 1640s and 1650s, when he was a younger man, wrote mostly political pamphlets. As I said, this was a time for all of these pamphlets, pamphlet wars, and Milton was a chief writer for the Puritan cause, so wrote mainly polemical prose, attacking the other side, but also arguing very strongly for the freedom and the ability to express oneself and one's opinion. So famously in 1644, he wrote this pamphlet, Areopagitica, which is usually seen as one of the most compelling arguments for the freedom of the press. This idea that you should be allowed to state your opinion in writing and in publishing without any repercussions. So this is really one of the foundational documents of this idea of a freedom of the press. So probably not a bad text to go back to in this time and age when the press is so strongly under attack. Now, these were turbulent times. I already gave you a very short sketch of what happened in the Civil War, and of course, one of the most disruptive events was the execution of the king. And very shortly after that, this book came out, Icon Basilicae, in 1649, which was supposed to be written by the king himself, sort of in the form of a diary, and that is kind of an apology for the king, in which he's also sort of turned rhetorically into like a Christian martyr. This is from the frontispiece that gives you kind of this idea of the king praying and submitting to this execution, but thereby sort of being elevated to this status of the martyr. And this book was widely dispersed. Remember, this is the Civil War is still raging. So that was part of the propaganda effort of the Royalists. And Milton answered this with his own book called Iconoclastes. The first one was the Book of the King, and this is sort of the image destroyer, and that is a very strong attack on personal attack on Charles I, which interestingly compared him to William Shakespeare's Duke of Gloucester, who afterwards became Richard III. So this consummate hypocrite. So we can see, if you remember from videos on the early modern age, that there was this idea of the Tudor myth in which Richard III, as the last king before the Tudor dynasty starts, has to be seen as this absolute perfect evil. And here this is sort of reused by casting Charles now in that role of the bad king. So we see how heavily involved Milton was in the politics of his time. In his personal life, he had health problems in that he turned blind. So by 1652, he was already totally blind, which of course makes writing much more difficult, but also leads to this idea, this almost myth of the blind poet, and that is something that Milton's often connected to. Now in 1660, we will talk more about this. The revolution ends, the Civil War sort of turns once more in that the monarchy is reinstated. So the son of the king whose execution Milton had lauded is brought back and becomes king again. So we can just imagine the fall from grace that someone like Milton would have. So after the crowning of Charles II, Milton was dismissed from government service. He was apprehended, he was imprisoned, and he would have likely died in prison were it not for the intercession of some important friends and family, including Andrew Marvell and Sir William Davenant, so other literary figures who brought about his release from prison. But from then on, of course, he's outside of the political sphere, and he's sort of officially shunned, and that's when the main part of Paradise Lost is composed. So we can see how it is started in this idea of a new world of God, new realm of God on earth being established, and then is worked on through this disillusion and this turn away in political terms. So here you have the dates again. The first version of the book was composed between 1658, so 2 years before the Restoration, until 1664, so 4 years into the Restoration, and then there was a largely expanded version that he finished in 1674. So we can also see that he worked on this for a long time. And the image you here see is a later reimagining of how it would have looked like with the blind Milton dictating his poem to his wife and his daughter. So they were acting as scribes here. So Milton had long cherished the ambition to write the definitive English epic, to do for the English language what Homer and Virgil had done for Greek and Latin, and what Dante had done for Italian at the start of the Renaissance. He had originally planned to base his epic on the Arthurian legends, which after all were foundational myths for English nationalism, but then he turned his attention to even more universal questions, and deciding to focus rather on the foundational myth of humanity itself, the Genesis account of the creation of the world and particularly of the fall of man. Now that was obviously a very ambitious project because Milton was determined to attempt, as he writes himself, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, to do something that nobody had ever tried even. And his success is certainly indicated by the esteem in which the poem is held to this day. No other epic poet had ever attempted to treat a subject as vast as Milton's treatment of the fall of man, dealing in a Christian framework with primary questions of beginnings and endings, good and evil, and of human destiny in the universe. Paradise Lost had immeasurable influence on literature. This is, next to the Bible, this is probably the text that has most verbal linguistic echoes that you can hear, that writers read this text and felt influenced and felt inspired by this text. And not just writers, this is a very, very visual text that creates incredible images in our minds, and that's what it should do, and that's what inspired also so many illustrations of the text. I just gave you here a list of some of the more well-known ones, by starting with the fourth edition, 1688, that had illustrations, but also we can see how the period of Romanticism was very, very strongly interested in Milton and illustrating him. Henry Fuseli, maybe the central Romantic painter, illustrated Paradise Lost. William Blake later in his life did as well, but also artists like John Martin or Gustave Doré. And I'm going to show you a few of those illustrations just to give you an idea of the different ways that these artists imagined Paradise Lost. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem itself. The first thing we certainly need to acknowledge is that this is a long poem. If you think poetry and imagine short text on a page, this poem has more than 10,000 lines of blank verse, so it has the size of a good novel. So definitely it's a little bit of a longer read in terms of poetry, but we definitely want to encourage you to tackle that. Our recommendation, as you can see from the reading list, is to start trying to read the first book. Now the whole poem is divided into 12 books, which is basically just a fancy way of saying chapter that is used for epic poetry. So definitely try to check out the first of the 12 books. As for the story, the core story is that of the temptation of man by Satan in the Garden of Eden, but that's not how the story starts. It starts actually with the prehistory of that temptation, and that prehistory is the war in heaven, is the rebellion of Satan against God's omnipotent rule. And we can of course hear sort of echoes of the civil war, of this rebellion against an all-powerful force here. The image that you can see is Michael casting out Satan out of heaven. So it actually starts right after that fall of Satan, and by falling he creates hell. So the first images that we get is Satan rousing himself first from his fall, and then rousing his companions and creating pandemonium, and then finding out that God has created the world and has created man, and he's so jealous that he just wants to spoil the fun, and then he turns into the snake and gets to the Garden of Eden and tempts man. So theologically speaking, as I said, the purpose of this whole book is to justify the ways of God to men, which is of course an extremely daring attempt, both from a literary point of view, but also from a theological point of view. You're usually not presumed to know God's purposes and therefore be able to justify them to man. So this is really a very, very bold enterprise. As an epic, Paradise Lost does adopt many of the conventions of the epic. We can see that it takes on many of the formal convention. It has a statement of the subject in the opening lines. It has these invocations of the muses. It has scenes on earth, in heaven, and in the underworld, dramatic dialogues, extended descriptive passages, but also elaborate similes, divine messengers, prophecies, and dreams. And it also follows that tradition of starting in medias res, so in the midst of things. So as I said, it starts with this moment that Satan sort of awakens again after his fall, and then we get the backstory of that later on, and then also we get, of course, how the story evolved from that on. But Milton also transforms the epic convention that he adopts. For example, in the beginning, he stresses that the muse that he invokes isn't the classic Greek muse, but rather a Christian muse. So he tries to take these conventions and make them his own. His version of the meter used in classical epics is blank verse, which is a new medium for the English epic. This was the first time that this was used for the English epic. This blank verse is basically an unrhymed iambic pentameter. So the pentameter, we're not going to do introduction to literary studies here, but you should definitely recognize an iambic pentameter, because this is by far the most common meter in English literature. So whenever you see a line of poetry and someone asks you, what is the meter here? Check out first whether it isn't an iambic pentameter, because chances are it is. So this is how an iambic pentameter looks like. Pentameter just means 5 feet. So we have these, and this is a foot here. This means unstressed, stressed. So we have 5 of those. I don't know why they are, the distance is also different. So we have da-dum, 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 5 times. Unstressed, stressed. And then if you just add lines after these, without rhyming them, you have blank verse. In different combinations, you can have different forms. We'll talk about these later. So, but one of the features of this is that the sense, the meaning, the syntactical and the semantic meaning of the words is variously drawn out from one verse into another, and the effect is a strong onward movement that is, of course, very necessary for a long poem. Now if you imagine 10,000 lines, that could sound very repetitive and boring very easily. But what Milton does is that he has this sort of core structure of the iambic pentameter, but in the way that he creates his text, he diverges from this. So these are the opening lines of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. So we can see you can do that, right? You can do the iambic pentameter, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to actually read it like that. Look at the next 2 lines. With loss of Eden till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. So this isn't how you would read that, but rather you would continue reading across the line. So this is one thing that Milton does, that he uses these we call them enjambments, these run-on lines where the syntactical unit doesn't end at the end of the line, right? Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. That's a unit, but it's broken by the line. When that means that you just need to continue reading, and you don't say of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste, but rather of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, and so on. So you're being drawn by the sentence structure to read on and to continue reading. And here you have the full first sentence actually of the poem. So this already tells you that there's sort of a grand style at work, certainly, as befits a religious epic, but with wide variations, but also its own complexities. As kind of a reading tip to get into this, it can help to try to find your way through the syntax, which can be labyrinthine. If we're looking at that here, we can try to isolate sort of the core sentence here. And I try to highlight these here in red. So really the first sentence is, of man's first disobedience, sing, heavenly muse, and I invoke thy aid. So that's the core message. I'm asking the heavenly muse to sing me the song. This is the classic invocation at the beginning of an epic poet to ask for inspiration, to sing this story of man's first disobedience. And then once you've identified that, you can see where the other parts of the sentence are going with you and what they're trying to do. So this is one thing. Try to grapple with the syntax. Try not to read line by line, but rather in larger units, and then sort of fill in the blanks of, or the subsections of meaning. Also, as I try to show, don't make it sound too much like poetry when you're reading it in your mind. You can actually read it more like prose, and it will work usually better because you get the meaning and the syntax better, and it will still keep that the beauty of the structure and the measured language. So it should sound in your head maybe a little bit more like prose than poetry, but also last tip, visualize the descriptive quality of this. As I said, Paradise Lost is so well known for creating these images. So definitely go along, look at illustrations that give you an idea, and particularly if you look at several illustrations, that gives you an idea of the range of possibilities. But also when you're reading, try to visualize yourself, try to picture things in your minds, which sometimes can be very difficult. I'm going to give you here one of the most famous examples of a visual description, which in itself is an impossibility here, which is when Satan is on his way to creation, and he passes by death's door, and this is how Milton describes this: a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell, hope never comes that comes to all. So try to imagine, try to visualize darkness visible, visible darkness. So it's one of the nice paradoxes of visual representation, actually. So to go ahead and try to tackle Paradise Lost, certainly one of the great reading experiences that you can have, also one of the great challenges, but that's what we are here for.